Chapter 34. Sometime in the middle of the second day, Skylar stopped in her tracks between one step and the next. I froze next to her, instantly scanning the trees around us for danger. I hadn't heard anything, but she knew the woods better than me. "What is it?" She turned to me, and I couldn't read the expression on her face. "Did you sense anything just now?" "No," I answered slowly. "Why?" She looked behind us, then at me again. "I think we just entered the Silinu Makiku." "Oh," I said flatly. It wasn't like my precog had been doing anything for me, but it was uncomfortable knowing that it was gone in a place where it should have always worked. "I mean, I'm not certain, but we can test. Can you throw out a mental shout?" Maybe? I'd never tried to mentally shout to a telepath before. Anyone could, theoretically. Only telepaths can receive, though. I thought as loud as I could toward Skylar. "Can you hear me?" Skylar watched me patiently. I shook my head. "I asked if you could hear me, but I guess you can't." "Nope, I didn't hear anything. I guess that means we're completely dependent on our wits now." "How?" I hesitated, asking the question that had been bothering me since we started out, but decided that without our talents, it was time to voice my concerns. "Do you know where we're going?" "You didn't see them, but there have been signs along the way. I've been following markers along the trail, signs I know to look for that strangers wouldn't recognize as unusual." "Like what?" Skylar looked in the direction we'd been heading and pointed. "See that tree there?" "I see lots of trees," I said lamely. Skylar spun her finger in small circles. "That one with the smooth pale bark and light leaves?" I followed her finger and noticed the tree she was referring to. "Yes?" "That's one of the markers. Look around. Do you see any more trees like that?" I glanced around, trying to take note of the different trees and plants I saw. It all seemed to blur into one giant mass of greenery most of the time, and I didn't have enough interest in botany to care to pay attention to the differences. But now that she'd pointed out the oddity, I vaguely saw a white blur in the distance behind us. "Just the one over there," I pointed. "Right. The trees were planted by the Parasa as trail markers between their temples and major landmarks on the river. Pilgrims would use the paths to travel the Amazon safely." My eyes practically bulged out of my head, I'm sure. "The entire way? And what's a Parasa?" I thought about how far we'd already traveled in just 3 days, and how much longer the Sikuni said the trip might take. How long would it have taken to plant trees the entire length of the Amazon? Skylar nodded. "A Parasa is the head of our religious order, like a priest or priestess. It was one of their tasks. Here, too, you can see what looks like an animal trail, but used to be a footpath for travelers." She motioned to the ground around us, and I frowned as I tried to find the path she was talking about. No, not really." Skylar shrugged. "It's been a few hundred years or so since anyone's used it, so it's of course been overgrown some. Maybe you can just see it because you grew up here. You know what you're looking for. I barely went for hikes in the park as I grew up." Skylar chuckled. "Probably. There are also rock formations between the trees sometimes to let you know if you veered off the path, like signposts pointing the way back to the trail." I shook my head in disbelief. I'd probably get us turned around and heading backwards in half an hour if you told me to lead. I found myself musing out loud about how Aaron was doing during our hike on the 4th day. "What's that?" Skylar glanced over at me. "Oh, Aaron. He's my best friend, the one I told you about, who I called after my accident. I was able to send him a message before I left, but I don't know what the school's told him, if anything. I hope he's doing all right." "Why wouldn't he be?" I ended up telling her not just about what happened to Val, but also all about our last 5 years of friendship. How we met at the laser tag arcade, how we would hang out nearly every weekend during the summer, his genius IQ, and how he was studying at both the tech and magic universities. "He sounds like a great guy." "He is. I couldn't ask for a better friend. He's helped me through so many difficult times." "And you don't have any other feelings for him?" No, not really. Thoughts of Mikhail intruded into my mind. I'd been so in love with him that I hadn't even considered Aaron as a romantic option. Why do you ask? It's just the way you talk about him. I don't think he thinks of me that way either, anyway. She didn't say anything else. Silence filled the space between us again, but this time I felt oddly uncomfortable with it. So, what about you? Do you have any friends? I asked the first thing that came into my mind. She said, considering. I travel too much to form close relationships with anyone. Hazards of the job, I guess. You're not always working, are you? You don't have any friends back home, wherever that is? I mean, in the States, that is. I quickly corrected myself, remembering her original home was the country we were currently in. She shook her head. No. I mean, I'm not always working, of course. But if I'm not traveling for work, I'm traveling for other reasons. I have a small place I crash at when I'm back in the States, but I don't really have any place I call home. You should come by my town sometime then. Meet Aaron. We could all hang out together. I offered impulsively, then bit my lip. I didn't know why I had offered something like that. We'd known each other for barely 4 days, but she seemed like the kind of person I could get along with in normal life. She looked at me and smiled. I was sure she'd perfected her smile for the camera, but this one seemed genuine. Maybe I will. We'll have to see what comes out of our journey here first, don't you think? Well, it would be hard for you to visit me there when we're both not quite lost here in the middle of the Amazon rainforest. She laughed, just as I hoped she would. So, why don't you have an accent if you're originally from around here? It was something my linguistic mind had been wondering since shortly after we met. I worked hard to erase it, and I've had almost a decade to do it. Another question? I asked. She made a sound of approval. Why did you pick the United States to go to when you left here? Why not Britain? Or Portugal, even? I imagine you already speak Portuguese, if that village was any indication. Ah. She was silent for a moment. I suppose it's because it's such an interesting melting pot of different cultures. You can go to any country and learn about their specific culture, but in the States, you can learn about almost every culture simply by walking down the street. I see, I said. But in truth, I hadn't really thought about the United States that way before. I'd always been so eager to travel the world to learn about the different people, I hadn't considered that the country I lived in was already full of them. And for someone who grew up in the middle of a jungle, being surrounded by so many different people was amazing. A culture shock for sure, and terrifying at times, but amazing too. And you became a reporter so you could travel and learn more? I guessed. I suppose that's one reason. Travel places, meet interesting people, be in the middle of events as they unfold. She was silent for a moment before continuing on. The hardest part of it all, though, was living in a world without magic. I mean, yes, it works at night, but I grew up in a place where it worked all the time. Only being able to use it half the day, and that being the part where I spent the majority of the time unconscious, was a challenge to get used to. And you have telepathy, right? That's right, she answered. It comes in handy in my job sometimes. I supposed it could. Hear the right mental shout and you could be at the scene of an unfolding event before anyone else. It's also why I volunteer to take the stories based around here or Indonesia, she continued. I couldn't help smiling at that. So you can be near the magic zones. She nodded. It's nice to be back in the magic world again sometimes. It was around the middle of that afternoon when we emerged from the trees into a space that had obviously been cleared out in the past, but was now overgrown with low-lying bushes and scattered trees. In the center of the ex-clearing were the ruins of a large stone structure covered in moss and vines. One particularly tall tree on the opposite side of the building towered overhead. It was big enough to comfortably house at least a couple dozen people, with small glass-stained windows lined high along the side walls and long, narrow windows lower down. Inside, the walls were covered in carvings and inscriptions, as were 6 pillars that held up the high roof. The windows had survived the decades, and the interior of the building was in relatively good repair and free of vegetation, the stone carvings clean and crisp. The only major sign of age was the disintegrating wooden benches that encircled a small raised dais upon which a low stone altar stood. I slowly meandered around the single room, periodically brushing my fingers along the engraved script. "Does anything look familiar to you?" Skylar came up beside me as I gazed at the constellation that seemed to represent Kadisuru, carved large into the wall opposite the door. I shook my head. "Only what was in the photos. You sure you don't know what any of this means?" Skylar pointed to a word on the wall. "This is his name. Over here," she walked to the side wall, "is his mortal name, Kadin. In between," she waved to the back wall again, "we suspect is his origin story based on the few words we could translate." "You said it's a religious script?" Skylar nodded. "Komodoru," it was called. The word jogged my memory back to the story I'd read that Khrushchev had reluctantly led me to, and I berated myself for not remembering sooner. "S. Phillips," I murmured, then more clearly, "You're the one who wrote the article on Kadin and the inscription on the shrine." She raised an eyebrow in shock. "How do you know about that?" "My South American literature teacher told us to look up Kadisuru. Well, him or Inti, an Inca god. But I didn't find it on my own. I damn well tried," I practically growled. "But I could hardly find anything on Kadisuru until one of my classmates pointed me towards your story. I don't know how he knew to find it, but..." I paused my tirade, a sudden thought coming to me, and I almost laughed. "Actually, maybe I do know how he found it if he's Yedramora." "Possibly," Skylar agreed. "A Yedramora would know to look up Kadin when searching for information on Kadisuru. And it was written by an S. Phillips. I never would have thought it was you if we hadn't come here together." Etchings on a short side of the altar drew my attention, and I turned to examine it. Lines and boxes and upside-down V-shapes were scattered across the surface, and I recognized it as one of the photos Skylar had taken. Something beyond that recognition nagged at the back of my mind this time, though. "What's this?" I asked, crouching down beside the stone block. "You had a picture of it. Is it important?" I traced a thick line along the right side of the stone face, then followed a narrower one that came out nearly perpendicular to it before branching off into a Y shape. The lower line passed by a box before heading down into the field of inverted V's, branching several times and eventually connecting to a series of other boxes. One of the lines ended by the bottom right corner at a box larger than the others. Skylar came up behind me. "Possibly some sort of map. Nobody was able to tell me what it was a map of, though. Nothing else on the altar gave any clue." The words finally triggered the memory that had been eluding me for days. "The gray path will show itself at dawn and dusk." "What's that?" I looked up at Skylar, feeling a mix of confusion, relief, and excitement. "I had a dream about reading a map, and those were the words written on it." "Okay," Skylar frowned, confused. I gestured around the building. "It was written in this script." "You can read this?" Confusion and disbelief colored her words. "No," I shook my head. "My dream translated it for me, but the map, it looked similar to this." "Do you know where it leads?" I sighed and looked back at the pictograph. "No idea. Any idea what a gray path might be?" There was a pause before she answered, and I glanced up to see her frowning in thought. "Aside from another name for the Parasa's path, no," she finally replied. I nodded thoughtfully and examined the engraving again. "In the dream, this line was a river," I said, touching the heavy vertical line. "And the boxes looked like houses. Then the lines shifted and a new line appeared. I assumed that was the gray path. Does that help at all?" "It could be any river," she said, "but I don't know any major rivers that run north-south that might be used as a landmark, like this one seems to be." I contemplated the map for a moment longer before rising and brushing off my knees. "Well, I don't have anything else then." A thought occurred to me. "Have you checked out the forest around the clearing, for any of those white trees that mark a path?" It might give us an idea of which box we're at if we knew which way the next marked path goes. Skylar nodded. I looked for it the last time I was here. I found a trail heading northwest from here, but I didn't follow it. Why not? Mostly because I don't know how far it goes, and I wasn't provisioned for more than a couple weeks worth of travel. So why don't we go that way now? It seems like that's a fairly safe option. Well, that's what I would have suggested, except you seem to have gotten a sign that there's another way we should go. You're going to trust me to lead us through the Amazon? I asked, a panic rising in me. No, if your gray path is real, I'm sure there's going to be markers along the way that I can find. But first we need to locate it. And if we can't, we'll follow the pilgrim's path. I sighed in relief and looked around the temple again. My eyes stopped on the engraving of Orion, and I walked over to it. So, this hunter they talk about crossing the sky? Cadden? I've assumed they're talking about the constellation Orion, with the red star being the drop of blood. Skylar nodded. Here, Orion crosses straight overhead all year round, so it's not surprising the old religion believed it to be the symbol of a god. It does? That's cool. I considered for a moment. So, how do you actually see the stars? I mean, there's a canopy of trees almost everywhere. You saw the open field in the village? She asked. I nodded. And they cleared this area out. Yeah, but you can't see the horizons. Your field of view is limited to an opening above. I can show you later if you'd like. Even if your gray path shows up this evening, I think we'll just camp out here until dawn and hope it shows up again. I don't want to go wandering in the dark, and we are going to need sleep. I glanced at the high windows, where I knew the sky was overcast outside. I am not looking forward to hiking in the rain for the next month. As if on cue, I heard the plop, plop of rain hitting the roof, and the air outside the window began to sparkle as falling drops of water glistened in the muted light.